Dwayne Johnson stood in his apartment, gazing at himself in the mirror. He felt a certain anxiety, but also excitement. The idea was simple: to become invisible, unknown, someone no one would recognize. And all of this was to see the world through the eyes of someone who faces prejudice and misunderstanding every day. At first, he took off his expensive shirts and pants and put on an old, worn hoodie that he found in the back corner of the closet. It was tied at the waist, with worn-out sleeves. Then he put on jeans that looked like they'd been worn for years, and old sneakers that looked as though they'd been through 2 seasons of dirty weather. Dwayne checked the clothes on himself. He looked as inconspicuous as possible. Now it was time for the makeup. He pulled out a makeup kit he usually used for costume transformations on movie sets. First, all the features that could remind people of his fame disappeared from his face. Dwayne painted dark spots and wrinkles on his skin, creating the effect of someone who had endured several hard years on the streets. His hair was hidden under the dark hood of a hoodie, and to complete the look, he put on black sunglasses that concealed his eyes from any potential recognition. The look was convincing enough. Dwayne took one last glance in the mirror, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. He was ready to become a part of a world he had never thought about in his life. With the first steps on the street, his perception of the world changed drastically. No one paid attention to him, as if he were just a shadow among the crowd. The street was filthy, trash scattered on the sidewalks, and the smell from the streets was so oppressive it seemed to settle in his chest. People passed by, not noticing him. Not a single glance stopped on him, and even the dogs running nearby only glanced at him once in a while and continued on their way. If anyone looked, it was only with some form of disregard, most likely because of his appearance, which was inevitable when you were homeless. But no one stopped, no one asked, no one helped. Dwayne felt the cold, indifferent gaze of society toward those who weren't worth attention. Sometimes he encountered groups of young people laughing at someone who resembled him, unaware that this transformation was being carried out by a Hollywood actor. From time to time, he met other homeless people sitting on dirty cardboard boxes or benches, hurrying to pass by so as not to miss the chance to warm their hands by the fire lit by a former street vendor at the corner. In their gazes, Dwayne felt the same indifference he had observed in society. No one cared about the problems of others. Only those who lived on the streets could understand each other, even if it was through simple but important signs, broken shoes, a torn jacket, or a dirty bag. But this was only the first part of his experiment. Dwayne moved cautiously, observing how people treated others like him. What did they really think, and how did they feel about those who were forced to live on the streets? These questions troubled him, and he couldn't wait for the first important conversation he had been anticipating. Dwayne walked further, moving down the street until his gaze stopped on a small cafe with dirty windows and old tables outside. The air was filled with the aromas of coffee and fresh pastries, but the smells of garbage still lingered on the street. He felt a sudden hunger and a desire to escape this world for a few minutes. He decided to go in. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the cafe door, as if sensing that this step might change his perception. He was ready to be told to leave, that he didn't belong there. In the whole city, he looked like he came from another world, foreign, forgotten, stripped of his dignity. But it was all part of the experiment, and he had to go through it. As he stepped inside, the smell of coffee and freshly baked rolls immediately overwhelmed him, but he tried not to pay attention to it. Behind the counter sat a young woman who immediately looked up, evaluating his appearance. Her eyes were soft, but also scrutinizing. She didn't look ready to help, but she didn't immediately push him away either. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but somewhat detached. Dwayne remained silent for a few seconds, hesitating before answering. "Just coffee. Black, please." He placed a few coins on the counter, enough to pay for his order, but clearly not for a tip. She silently took the money and prepared the coffee. The cafe was filled with silence. only the soft murmur of music from a speaker and the sounds of the espresso machine breaking the calm. When she handed him the cup, he took his first sip, watching how people at the tables glanced at him, some stopping for just a moment. Their eyes were cautious, slightly contemptuous, yet also surprised. Dwayne felt a wave of misunderstanding and alienation wash over him. He didn't belong here. He was an outsider, unwanted. A man at the neighboring table coughed, looked at Dwayne, and then quickly turned away. His glance was so quick and superficial that Dwayne immediately understood. In his world, there was no place for him. But unlike what he might have expected, there were no malicious looks or shouts, just indifference that he couldn't come to terms with. People didn't approach him with aggression, but they didn't see anything human in him either. He sat at the table, drinking his coffee, feeling how this ordinary situation, which could have been every day for many, became a real trial for him. He looked at the people who were laughing, joking, drinking their coffee, and realized that to them, he was simply nobody, that he had no meaning here, no right to their attention, or even to anything more than this cup of hot coffee. When he left the cafe, he once again felt the gaze of passers-by, but this time not with anger or contempt. Now it was just a minor and indifferent observation of yet another figure on the sidewalk who had no place in their world. In his heart there was still emptiness, but he knew that this experience couldn't be ignored. It was important for understanding what the world of the homeless looked like, how they existed among people, but remained outside of them, outside their world. And so, in that small cafe, he understood that only through such perception could one begin to understand how this vast, yet indifferent world truly works. Dwayne stepped out of the cafe, feeling the cold air pierce his face. He wrapped himself in a jacket that no longer warmed him and walked down the street, trying to organize his thoughts. His hands were in his pockets, and inside him, there was a strange feeling, a mix of irritation, humiliation, and relief. He had done it. He had gone through this trial. But now the question was what to do next. On the sidewalk, he saw an elderly man sitting on a cardboard box by the trash can. His clothes were dirty and worn, his face gray from the cold, and his eyes were empty. The man silently smoked a stub of a cigarette, which barely glowed in his fingers. Dwayne stopped. This man was a real homeless person, not temporary. Like Dwayne, not for an experiment. This was his real world, and he lived in it every day. Dwayne hesitated whether to approach. He felt a wave of anxiety take over him. What could he say to this man? What could he offer him, besides the awkwardness of his presence? But his feet carried him closer. "Hey," Dwayne mumbled, stopping beside the man. He looked up slowly, his eyes focusing on Dwayne. "What do you want?" The man's voice was low and raspy. Dwayne sat down beside him on the curb, feeling the cold concrete seep through his thin pants. "Nothing," he said. "Just decided to sit here." The man looked at him suspiciously, then took another drag from his cigarette and nodded. "Sit then. There's room." Dwayne sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to find the words. "How did you end up here?" he finally asked. The man smiled slightly, but the smile was bitter. "Like everyone. Lost everything. Family. Home. Job. At first, you think it's temporary, that everything will work out soon. But a week goes by, then a month. Then a year. And you no longer expect anything to change." Dwayne nodded, staring into the distance. He felt a heaviness grow in his chest. He knew the man was telling the truth, the very thing everyone feared when passing by the homeless. It could happen to anyone. "I'm Dwayne," he said, extending his hand. The man looked at him somewhat surprised, but then shook his hand. "Tom," he replied. They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Tom stubbed out the cigarette on the pavement and nodded toward Dwayne. "You don't look like you've been on the streets for long." Dwayne smiled faintly. It's kind of an experiment. I want to understand what it's like to be here." Tom sighed deeply and shook his head. Understanding it isn't enough, he said. As long as you know you can go home, it's not the same. You can leave this place anytime. Dwayne felt how those words hit straight to his heart. He knew it. And it made it even harder. He could leave it all, go back to his life, but Tom, he couldn't. His reality was forever written into these cold streets. So what do I do? Dwayne asked. Tom shrugged. If you want to understand what it's really like, stay here. Lose everything. And then you'll see. Dwayne silently stared at the sidewalk. His heart was pounding. He could leave right now. He could go back home, take a shower, lie in his bed. But how would he ever understand what Tom felt? How could he understand this hopelessness? Tom got up and stretched. Well, it's time for me to go. If you want to come with me, let's go. If not, we'll still see each other here. Dwayne got up and followed Tom, not fully understanding what was pulling him. But something told him he had to walk this path to the end, even if it meant losing everything he had known before. They walked down the quiet street, where only the dim light from the street lamps cut through the darkness. Tom walked ahead, not looking back, his hands in the pockets of his shabby coat. Dwayne followed him, listening to the sounds of the city at night, the distant hum of cars, the clanging of garbage cans in alleys, and occasionally muffled voices. Where are we going? Dwayne asked. You'll see, Tom replied, without even turning his head. They turned into an alley between two buildings, where the smell of trash and dampness hit Dwayne's nose. Tom stopped by a metal door, scratched at it with his fingernail, and waited. A minute later, the door opened, and a burly man in a sports jacket appeared. His eyes quickly scanned Tom, then rested on Dwayne. New guy, he asked gruffly. Just temporarily, Tom replied, stepping inside. Dwayne hesitated, but then followed. Inside, the dim light from a single bulb hung from the ceiling. A few plastic chairs were scattered around, a wooden table, and an old couch with torn upholstery. Cigarette butts and empty beer cans littered the floor. Two men sat on the couch, one smoking, the other sleeping with his face buried in a pillow. This place is for the regulars, Tom said, sitting on a chair. You can crash here for the night if you know who to ask. Dwayne sat across from him, cautiously taking in the room. His gaze stopped at the cigarette in one of the men's hands, trembling fingers, chipped nails, a scar on the wrist. These people didn't look threatening, but there was something else in their eyes, something broken. How do you stand this? Dwayne asked, looking at Tom. Tom shrugged. You get used to it. At first, it's scary, then it hurts, and then it just becomes the same. The hardest part is the first month, when you think someone will come and save you. But no one will. And then you start to understand that either you adapt or what? Tom smiled bitterly. Or you end up like the guy under the bridge, until someone finds you frozen to death. Dwayne felt a tightness in his chest. He imagined himself in the same state, dirty clothes, on the cold floor, with no hope for the future. It seemed impossible. But Tom spoke so calmly, as if it were just the normal way of things. Then why are you still here? Dwayne asked. Tom ran his hand through his hair, sighed, and looked down at the floor. Because I have nowhere else to go. The door opened again, and a girl in a bulky jacket walked in. She was young, no older than 25, but her eyes looked like they had seen more than someone her age should have. She glanced at the people in the room, then walked over to Tom and sat down next to him. Hey, Tom, she said softly. Hey, Meg. Meg nodded at Dwayne. New guy. Something like that, Tom said. Meg looked at him more closely. You don't look like you're from here. Dwayne nervously smiled. It's an experiment. Meg laughed briefly and coldly. Oh, seriously? You think you'll understand what it's like to hit rock bottom after a few days here? Dwayne felt his cheeks flush. He knew it sounded ridiculous. I just want to understand. Meg looked at him with the same emptiness in her eyes that he had seen in Tom's. Understanding won't do you any good, she said. But when you have no choice. Then you'll understand. She stood up and walked toward the door, paused in the doorway, looked at Tom, and said, "If you're still alive tomorrow, look for me in the third alley." Tom nodded. The door closed behind her. "Is she joking or what?" Dwayne asked. Tom looked at him. No. Dwayne felt a chill inside. He realized he had entered a world where jokes and reality had mixed, and he hadn't even touched the line yet where true survival began. Tom stood up. "If you want to keep going, we'll go. If not, you can turn back. But I'll warn you, if you go all the way, there's no turning back." Dwayne looked at the closed door, then at Tom, who was already standing by the exit. His heart pounded. This was the moment to make a choice. "I'll go with you," he said. Tom nodded and opened the door. "Then let's go." The next stop, rock bottom. Dwayne and Tom left the room, and the heavy metal door slammed shut behind them with a dull sound. It was even colder outside than before, and a light rain began to drizzle from the gray night sky. Tom walked confidently, as if he knew every corner of the city, while Dwayne trailed a little behind, gulping in the cold air and trying to keep his breath steady. They reached the main street, where neon signs of bars, stalls, and kiosks lit up the darkness. Dwayne noticed a group of teenagers in hoodies standing under a dim street lamp, smoking. One of them glanced at Tom, and there was a look of recognition in his eyes. "Do they know you?" Dwayne asked. "Everyone knows each other here," Tom replied without slowing his pace. "Those who survive know who to turn to." They approached a small cafe with a faded red sign that read Joe's Diner. The windows emitted dim light, and through the glass, Dwayne could see a few tables with cracked plastic and a couple customers sitting, staring at their phones. "They serve pretty good coffee here," Tom said, opening the door. Inside, there was the smell of stale fried oil and coffee. Behind the counter stood an elderly man in a white t-shirt with yellow stains. His eyes lifted to meet Tom's, and for a moment there was something like disgust in them, but he quickly looked away. "Take a seat," the man said without much enthusiasm. Tom and Dwayne sat at a corner table. Tom relaxed back into his chair, while Dwayne still sat tensely, his eyes scanning the interior. Holes in the upholstery of the chairs. Sticky dirt on the floor. Cracks in the plastic table. "Does he know you?" Dwayne asked quietly. "Of course." Tom leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "I used to work here." Dwayne raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Seriously?" Tom nodded. "Just a year ago. I worked in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, mopping floors. He paid me in cash. But then I started taking money from the register. At first, just a little to get by, until payday, and then more. One day he caught me. The choice was simple. Either I leave, or he calls the cops. I left. And then what happened?" "What happened?" Tom smiled crookedly. "Then I ended up on the street." The man behind the counter walked over to their table and placed a cup of coffee in front of Tom. "On the house," he said dryly. "Thanks, Joe," Tom replied, lifting the cup to his lips. "Don't think it's out of pity," Joe mumbled. "I just don't want you lying dead in my alley." Tom just smiled and took a sip of coffee. Dwayne noticed how Tom's hands trembled slightly. "Why is he helping you?" Dwayne asked. "Because he was in the same situation," Tom answered. "Only he managed to get out." Dwayne watched Tom carefully. His eyes were tired, but somewhere deep inside, there was still a flicker of life. "So what now?" Dwayne asked. Tom set his cup down and leaned closer. "Now we're going to the third alley." "To Meg." "Exactly." Dwayne felt his palms start to sweat. "And what's there?" Tom smiled. "She'll show you the real bottom, if you're ready to see it." Dwayne paused. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and if he followed Tom, there would be no turning back. "Then let's go," Dwayne finally said. Tom nodded, finished his coffee, and stood up. Joe gave him a look that was more of a warning than sympathy. "If you come back alive, stop by again," he said. Tom smiled. "If I come back alive, I'm not sure I'll want to." They left the cafe and walked further into the night, heading toward the third alley. Behind them, the weak light from the Joe's Diner sign faded. Ahead, there was only darkness and uncertainty. They walked down the dark street in silence. The third alley was ahead, narrow, dark, with broken glass on the asphalt and shattered windows of abandoned buildings. Only the dim light from a street lamp cast long shadows on the wet ground. Tom walked ahead, confidently paving the way through the chaos of this district, as if he had been here dozens of times before. Dwayne followed behind, his hands deep in the pockets of his jacket. The rain had stopped, but the air remained damp and heavy. Tom suddenly stopped in front of rusty metal doors, where the word entrance was sprayed in red. "Here," Tom said. "She's inside." Dwayne silently stared at the door, then shifted his gaze to Tom. There was something strange in his eyes, not just fatigue or pain. It was expectation. "Tom," Dwayne began quietly. Tom turned to him. "What?" Dwayne took a step closer and met Tom's gaze. "This is all an experiment." Tom's face darkened. His eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Dwayne took a deep breath and felt his heart start to pound in his chest. "What's happening to you is part of a big experiment. I'm part of it." Tom froze for a moment. "What the hell are you saying?" "Everything, from the moment you woke up on the street. It was planned. We were watching you, testing your reactions, your decisions, your emotions." Tom stepped back, his eyes filled with anger. "Are you kidding?" "No, Tom, I'm not kidding," Dwayne said calmly but firmly. "We wanted to understand how a person survives in the worst conditions. Could they keep their humanity if they're thrown to the bottom?" "And what?" Tom's voice trembled. "You just watched me die from hunger? Watched me sleep in the rain? Watched me steal food to survive? We couldn't intervene. That was the rule of the experiment. We had to see how you'd cope. And now what?" Tom took a step toward Dwayne, his face twisted in rage. "You want to say I was your lab rat?" Dwayne calmly looked him in the eyes. "You didn't just survive, Tom. You showed strength we didn't expect. You learned to trust, help others. You didn't break. And so what?" Dwayne slowly took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Tom. "Here's $100,000. Tom stared at the envelope, then at Dwayne. His hands were trembling. "What?" "This is your reward, Tom, for making it through this experiment." Tom stood still. Then slowly he took the envelope, opened it, and saw stacks of $50 bills. His eyes widened. Is this real?" "Completely real. You can do whatever you want with this money. Start a new life. Leave this city." Tom took a breath, his fingers still gripping the envelope. He looked up at Dwayne. "And you think this will fix all the shit I've been through?" "No," Dwayne replied. "But it's a chance to start fresh." Tom closed his eyes for a moment, then laughed, quietly, almost despairingly. "You know what, Dwayne? I don't know whether I should hit you or hug you. Do what you feel." Tom moved closer to him, their faces nearly touching. Then Tom took a deep breath and punched Dwayne in the jaw. Dwayne staggered, but stayed on his feet. "You deserve that," Tom said, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. Dwayne rubbed his jaw and smiled. "Maybe." Tom glanced at him one more time, then turned and walked down the alley into the darkness. The rain began to drizzle again. "And now what?" Dwayne called after him. Tom stopped, not turning around. "Now, I'll decide what happens next," and disappeared into the shadow of the alley.